Hey everyone, welcome back to Portal of Wisdom. I am back today with another story for you. So if you are new to the channel, like and subscribe and click that little post notification bell so you get alerted when I post new videos. So today's topic, this story is going to be about the lost gold mine of Padre LaRue. This is going to be in the New Mexico mountains. The challenging thing about this story is there are a couple of stories with a Mr. LaRue or Padre LaRue who was in the Spanish church. The Victorio Peak story that I've shared, a lot of people have mentioned that central character is Padre LaRue. And with this story also being a Padre LaRue, who we don't know if it's the same person or mixed up details, putting the same person in two different stories because they are in somewhat close proximity to each other, but the treasure locations, according to the map, they're probably 40 to 50 plus miles apart as the crow flies, even further by, roads and trails and stuff like that. So, and they're also separated by at least probably 100 years or more. So it could be that these two stories are completely different, yet people have mixed up the main character of the story into both stories. One that is in the late 1600s, early 1700s, and then this story is stated that it comes in at about 1797 for the year. And have a couple of sources for this story, and this story was in a Desert Magazine article in a 1944 issue. So we have that source, and then another source that also has a few details that are a little bit different, but not necessarily in a way that's going to affect the outcome of the story. Some of the details that led up to them being in this location where the treasure is can vary just a little, but anyhow, just wanted to share that. So it seems like it's about 50-50 with people that think the Victorio Peak treasure is the same one as this treasure, and then about 50% of the people think no, these are two absolutely different locations, and the Victorio Peak treasure is verifiable in the actual location because it seems like the military has found that one, and it was on Victorio Peak in the San Andreas Mountains, significantly further north of where this treasure location would be. So on that note, we will get into the story of the lost gold mine of Padre LaRue. Just wanted to give those details first, or else someone would mention in the comments that this is the same treasure as Victorio Peak, and there'd be plenty of people that would say, no, this is a different treasure. And some people have put Padre LaRue into both stories, and he may be in one of them, and the other one might be another central character, just being as a proximity probably got the central character mixed up many years ago. So this story starts out in the year of 1797, or at least that's what's stated in the 1944 article. So a gentleman by the name of Padre LaRue or Father LaRue. He was a Catholic priest in the monasteries or missions within the Catholic Church, and he was a new priest, and he was sent from the old world to New Spain. So he was stationed in Europe, whether it was Spain or France or somewhere along those lines, and he was sent to New Spain, which we know now as Mexico, and then the western half of the U.S., that was all part of New Spain in the 1700s. So he was sent to help with one of the new missions in the northern reaches of New Spain in an area called Chihuahua, which is now Chihuahua, Mexico. And he was one of 10 new priests that were sent to this new world at this time. In the New World or New Spain, the base of operations for the church was Mexico City. Everything was run out of Mexico City, and reports on the operations of the New World missions were all passed through Mexico City and then on to the Spanish crown. So many of these Spanish missions in the New World were built generally near where the Spanish had explored and a lot of times found gold and silver, and they may have been operating mines. Some of these missions were just in areas where they wanted to convert the natives to Catholicism or grow crops if the land was somewhat fertile around there to feed their growing empire. So there were areas where they were growing crops to feed the growing empire, and there were areas where the missions were there because they had gold and silver mines nearby and they were mining a lot of precious metals. It seems that the mission that Padre LaRue was in charge of had large fields of corn growing nearby, and it had a small creek that was being used to irrigate the corn and provide water for this small community of people around here. So it seems this mission and the community were fairly new, and Padre LaRue may have been one of the first fathers there in charge of the church and the growing operations and daily operations, including the cornfields. So normally reports of operations would be sent regularly or at least periodically from the mission operation to the main church operations or whatever back to Mexico City so that they could kind of keep tabs on how things were going in each of these new Padres locations. So keep in mind there were 10 fathers or 10 Padres sent to the New World. They all went to different locations, different missions within the area of New Spain, or a lot of them may have ended up in what would be northern Mexico or the western part of the U.S. And Padre LaRue, he kind of made himself an exception to this rule. He decided early on that since things weren't going very well at his location, that they were having issues with the creek was tending to dry up a lot more periodically. And if you know anything about growing corn, corn uses a heck of a lot of water. So if this wasn't a super large creek and they were diverting a lot of water trying to grow corn, maybe you can do that for a while. Corn uses a heck of a lot of nutrients also. So I've got a lot of experience in this, being as I have a degree in agronomy also, and so I know what corn can do, especially back in these days. If you can deplete the soil of a lot of your soil nutrients, and it can use a heck of a lot of water, and if you don't have a pretty steady continuous water source, it can be a challenge to grow corn. And some of these areas are kind of borderline close to the desert, which, you know, here in Arizona, they grow a heck of a lot of corn too, because corn really likes the heat and the sunshine and everything, but it uses a heck of a lot of water. So if you're in an area where you don't have a lot of water or you don't have a lot of consistent water, it can definitely be a challenge. And it sounds like this is probably likely what was happening in the fields around Padre LaRue's mission and with his community there, that they had a challenge keeping the crops flourishing. So Padre LaRue, he decided that he would wait until things improved before he reported back to his superiors. He probably didn't want to seem like a failure. So he figured that things would probably eventually get better and the creek waters would gradually return and the crops would again flourish, and at that point he would have good news to report to Mexico City, and having a lot more positive news would look better on him. So at this point he just was not checking in with Mexico City, and all the other 9 priests were regularly reporting back, but not Padre LaRue. So it was pretty much a given that his superiors would eventually send someone to check on him. But in the meantime, the crops were failing, the people were poor and hungry, and things looked very bleak. It was around this time that Padre LaRue was sitting with a dying soldier, and he was praying with him, and he was with this gentleman as he was in his final stages and about to pass on. And on his deathbed, the dying soldier told the Padre a secret that he had no use for any longer, as he was not going to be in this world much longer. Now, depending on the source, what exactly the soldier said is up for a little debate, or possibly varies a little bit depending on interpretation or maybe translation, because this likely was all in Spanish and Old Spanish. And I don't know, I think it could have been written down in Latin also, being as a lot of the priests in the monasteries and stuff in the 1600s, 1700s also wrote in Latin. So the interpretation of what exactly was said could have came through a couple of translations, and so that can maybe make things vary a little bit. Anyway, so it was likely that the Padre wrote things down as the fathers back in those days were extremely educated, and a lot of the general public were a lot more illiterate back in those days, and probably a lot of his followers may not have written things down. But the Padre, he wrote things down, and in the 1944 issue of Desert Magazine, it was stated that the dying soldier said, quote, "In the Sierra de los Órganos there is gold. I have seen it with my own eyes. It is no good for me to know of it now. Padre, our people are starving. Take them and go to the organs. Surely they will find the gold." End quote. So the Padre knew this soldier, who was also a part of their community, and he knew that he had traveled to the far northern reaches of New Spain, and you know, Father Padre, he became very interested in what he had to say. And the Padre wondered if God was maybe bringing a solution to his people's problems of hunger and poverty. So he questioned the soldier about how to find the gold and where these Organ mountains were that he spoke of. And the soldier continued on to say, according to the article, quote, "You must travel 10 days until you come to a place where the Rio Grande cuts its way through the mountains. They call it El Paso del Norte. 2 days' journey further north, and you will see the stone pipes of the Organ Mountains. At the north end, there is a pass, and the Spirit Springs. Nearby, you will find the Cueva Vegas, Cave of the Meadows, at the foot of a high cliff. The gold is there. Go, Padre, go, where the gold lies buried. You can save our people." End quote. Not long after telling the Padre all of the important details, the soldier died. Doesn't that always happen in all these stories? Anyhow, well, it happens in this one too. So now it seems that the Padre was between a rock and a hard place. He was stationed here at the mission in Chihuahua, and this is where he was supposed to be, and he was supposed to stay with his congregation here. But the weather and the conditions had been especially bad lately, and he was watching his people starve to death, and they had so little. So it seems he may have taken this story as a sign from God and as a way that he could help his people flourish again. It seems that the drought and the poverty and the hunger of his people made the decision for him. So they would head north and they would look for these riches, and that would solve their problems. This is what they decided to do. Now, I found another source that has a slightly different interpretation of what the soldiers said to the padre. And in that source, it was said, quote, "One day travel north of El Paso del Norte until you see three peaks. Upon first sight of these peaks, turn eastward and cross the desert toward the mountains. In the mountains you will find a basin where there is a spring at the foot of the solitary peak. On this peak you will find gold." End quote. Now this just could be the translation in a little bit more detail of the later parts of the directions. But there is one main variation here. This account says 1 day north of El Paso del Norte, whereas the other account from 1944 states 2 days north. So I guess we may not know exactly on that which one is correct. I guess if you see the three peaks, then you make your direction change at that point, whether it's a day north or 2 days north. So at this point, it was said that Padre LaRue, he talked to his congregation, he asked them what they wanted to do, and of course they were suffering from drought and starvation, so they could either go back to Mexico City and try to stay with family members, or they could go north and try to find this gold that he shared the story of with them. And of course, you know what the people wanted to do. They wanted to go for the gold and head north. Keep in mind that doing this the whole time Padre LaRue has been here, he is still not checked in with Mexico City. So he's been there, the fields are drying up. They're not really producing any corn. Things aren't going well. He's not checking in with Mexico City. The soldier dies. He's talking to his people. They decide they're going to head north. He's still not checking in with Mexico City. And he hasn't sent anyone to check in on their behalf either to pass along any news. And during all the chaos and the excitement of this new possibility, it was more or less an oversight again. They didn't remember to send anyone to Mexico City to check in for them. And so, anyhow, it didn't take the villagers too long, though, to prepare to go north, as they had very meager possessions and no longer had a fondness for the land that they probably felt had forsaken them now. So the group hit the main road a very short time after that. The Camino Real is the name of the road, which I believe means the Royal Road, and it was connected from Mexico City south all the way. It stretched all the way north to Santa Fe along the Rio Grande River and so on. This was one of the main roads or main thoroughfares in the old New Spain kingdom. So it was said that after 12 days of travel, they reached the green valley of the Rio Grande River and El Paso del Norte. And then they continued on and followed the river, and they reached the Native American village of Tortugas. And they traded some of their meager possessions for some food at this Native American village. North of there, they spotted the three peaks mentioned by the dying soldier. And here they turned to the east and they headed into the Jornada del Muerto desert, and they arrived at the base of the San Andreas Mountains. And this area, I believe the Organ Mountains and the San Andreas Mountains, they kind of come together. The San Andreas Mountains dead end onto the stretch of the Oregon Mountains here. So a lot of sources of this story do say that this particular mine or location is in the Oregon Mountains. Some of them may say it's in the very southern tip of the San Andreas Mountains, which stretch for many miles, probably 100 miles or more. So either way, it's It's right in the Oregon Mountains, or right at the very edge of the southern tip of the San Andreas Mountains. And like I mentioned earlier in the story, from this location or this general area, it's probably another 35 to 45, 50 miles north to Victoria Peak. So this is why a lot of people say that treasure is a whole separate treasure from another time. And of course, the Spanish were in these areas up and down the Rio Grande in the mountains, and there were a lot of things going on. Anyhow, but that's all for the other story. So back to this story. The other source on this story did say that after they left the Native American village, they headed into the Oregon Mountains, and they continued up a pass at the north end of these mountains, of the Oregon Mountains. So there's a little variation here, but maybe not that much. So it was said that they found a solitary mountain here with a spring named Spirit Spring, or they named it Spirit Spring. I don't know if it already had this name, or if the soldier had, I think the soldier had already called it Spirit Spring, so they went by that name. And it was said that after searching around this mountain, they did find a rich vein of gold in one of the canyons coming off of the mountain to the southwest of the spring. It was said that at this point, the Padre held Mass, and he warned everyone about the good and the bad that gold can bring. And he mentioned that they needed to make their new home as safe as possible from Apache attack or any intruders. And to do this, the Padre asked the men that were mining, the gold, to bring all the gold to him so that he could amass it, and he would go to the valley and the settlements, or go to El Paso del Norte for all of their needed supplies and food. And he hoped that this would keep their gold mine a secret, as they would not have multiple different men coming down out of the mountains with gold and stirring a lot of unwanted attention to their little commune or community in the mountains. He also had them build rock walls around their community for extra protection. So the gold stockpile built up as the months passed by, and the mine tunnel reached further back into the mine, or this canyon where the tunnel went further back out of the canyon. It got hollowed out even more. They had more caverns or chambers there. They used a lot of this area to store the gold, and so it started to pile up, these big gold ingots in this particular cavern. And this is another reason that some people say Victoria Peak is the same spot, because Victoria Peak also had some caverns in a mountain where a lot of gold ingots were stacked. So anyhow, it was said that the first signs of trouble, though, happened due to Padre LaRue himself. Through all of this time, Padre LaRue had never checked in with the church in Mexico City. And of course, we mentioned that's the hub of operations, and the Padre intended to check in shortly before they all left and headed north, and he wanted to appease his superiors and check in before they headed into this new territory. But during all the confusion and excitement, it never happened. And at this point, now that they were finding gold, it didn't seem like he wanted to report that, as that would bring a lot of attention that he didn't want from the church, and they would be sending lots of people up to mine it, and he probably worried that the people he was trying to help would just get pushed out of this location, as the Spanish would send their more professional type of miners in to take everything over. And of course, at this point, he probably worried that he would be reprimanded for what had happened and the fact that he hadn't been checking in. So As the months passed, the church did begin to be very interested in how things were going at the mission in Chihuahua, and since they hadn't heard anything from the father in charge there, Padre LaRue, they decided that they would send a representative, and they would have this representative check in on the community in Chihuahua. And the gentleman that they sent, his name was Maximo Miliano or Miano, and they sent him to check on the Chihuahua mission. And he arrived at the mission and the surrounding village, only to find that it was abandoned, and the fields where the corn was normally growing was drifted with sand. There was nothing growing in the fields, and it was pretty apparent that no one had been here for quite some time at this point. So Maximo, he made his way to a Native American village that wasn't too far from the mission at Chihuahua, and it was said he was able to bribe them to get what little info he could get them to provide on what happened to the villagers. And the only answer that he was able to receive was, "They go." So that's what the village chief had mentioned to him. So this wasn't much information for him, but it was all he could take back to Mexico City. And it did seem that they left of their own free will and nothing had happened to them from the local Native Americans or any other kind of attack. So once back in Mexico City, the church organized an expedition to figure out what happened to them and where they went. And after a year, it was a mere coincidence that the expedition happened to be in the little Native American village of Tortugas, north of El Paso del Norte. And here the natives told the expedition of the colony in the Oregon Mountains. And they also told them about the gold that they were trading for food and showed them some of the gold. So Maximo, who was still heading this expedition, so Maximo and the rest of the expedition, they made their way into the Oregon Mountains to the east and found the community there. And once there, they approached the rock walls of the community and called for Padre LaRue. And when the Padre appeared, they told him that the gold and everything that they were mining belonged to the church, as LaRue was a representative of the church. So the 1944 source states that LaRue said, and quote, according to the Desert Magazine article, they say LaRue said, quote, "Senor, the mine does not belong to me. Consequently, it cannot belong to the church. God led a dying soldier to disclose its existence to us, and God helped us to develop it. It has been our only source of livelihood these years. Since the gold belongs to my people, I refuse to deliver over one small portion to you or to the church. I would suggest that you return to Mexico City and forget us." End quote. You probably know how that's going to go over. So Maximo was not let past the rock walls or into their little city or village, and him and his small expedition, they had to leave and head back to Mexico City and pass along this news. So once Maximo and the expedition left, the Padre knew it would not be very long before they would return in much greater numbers. After the expedition left, the Padre started to have his followers close up the mine and prepare to leave. There was also some bad blood brewing with the neighboring Apaches, who were not too fond of these white men that took over their land around their sacred spring that they had used for many years. Within a few days, and before the colonists could leave, the Apaches actually attacked. And they did so one evening when the thunder and storms had come, and the noise of the storm likely covered a lot of their approach. They filled the village and the villagers with arrows and sent flaming arrows into the wooden roofs of their adobe houses to burn down everything that was wood within them. And before you can say, well, how can these houses start fire during a thunderstorm? You need to realize what desert storms are like. I've been here for a long time, and a good majority of the desert storms do not necessarily always include a lot of rain. Or sometimes there's a big thunder and lightning show for a long time before the rains come. And this probably was what was going on. The skies can rumble and the clouds can be dark, and it can look like rain, and maybe a light sprinkle happens for a while or a short period of time, and then maybe the skies open up and sometimes they just move on past and it doesn't happen at all. But this happens a lot during monsoon season, which is the kind of a late summertime here in the southwestern deserts. So it appears the initial attack by the Apaches happened when there's a lot of lightning and thunder, and the rain hadn't really started, and they took out a lot of the villagers, and they left behind a bunch of bodies and a decimated village in the canyon. And a few of the colonists were said to be able to escape the raid and make it to high ground and survive. And some of these colonists are probably where some of this story comes from, because not everyone was done away with at this point. So the colonists said that there was not much left of their village after the Apaches left and the torrential monsoon rains came and a flood swept through their canyon, and the floodwaters finally receded and there just wasn't much left. It was said that the mine was also no longer, as it was either filled in with a bunch of rock and boulders from the flood, or it may have been kind of rocked in before the Apache attack, and then a lot of additional rock and boulders from the flood then sealed it up even more. We don't know exactly, but it was said that it wasn't very conspicuous where this mine had been after the attack and the flood. But apparently these caverns behind the sealed up rock had a cache of large gold ingots that were still buried behind tons of rock somewhere in this canyon. And the one challenge with finding Padre LaRue in the records too is that he doesn't seem to be in the records very much, according to people that have done a lot of research. And that could very well be because he was a dark spot on the church at this point in the New World, and maybe his story or situation would not have made the King of Spain very happy with the operations in Mexico City, and so it may have been a situation where they didn't document too much of what was going on here, especially when I'm sure they showed up later to mine gold and the city had vanished and the walls were gone and the area had been flooded and most of the colonists had been killed. The Spanish probably just let it be and didn't really want to mention it in the records. Now, the story doesn't quite end there. In the 1944 account, it states that in 1907, a prospector visited Teso Aguirre, who was a descendant of one of the original colonists that escaped the Apache massacre. And they visited Teso's mountain home, maybe somewhere in that area. It doesn't say exactly where Teso's mountain home was, but this particular prospector in 1907 was shown the location of the Cave of Gold. So it appears that this descendant stayed in that particular area, very likely, but anyhow, so the prospector was shown the location of the Cave of Gold, but did not see any gold because likely probably was still behind tons and tons of boulders and sealed up. So this part was not really clarified as to how exactly they knew that this was the exact location, but I guess if this was a descendant, I'm sure each generation, maybe someone within the family pointed out this is where the gold is. It sits behind quite a few tons of rock here, and in those days, especially if we're referring to 1907, there's not really any big equipment you could get into this desolate kind of area to remove all this rock. So anyhow, there was that account where someone said they were shown where it was by a descendant of an original colonist. There was another man named Colonel A.J. Fountain of Las Cruces that claimed he found an old record in the mission at Mesilla or Doña Ana, and these are locations near Las Cruces, New Mexico, where there were missions at that point. And I guess if you think about it, these would be the closest missions to where this community was, and if there were some records, I'm sure when people came up from Mexico City, they probably stopped at these missions to resupply and whatever, and then head up into the mountains to find the colonists. So it does seem logical that there could have been some records at one of these two mission locations that were the closest missions to where this gold mining community was. And in this document, it was said that it described the mine as one of the richest in Spanish America. And it also mentioned that it was located near the present-day town of Oregon, New Mexico. That's Organ, not like the state. So if that's the case, if it's located near Oregon, New Mexico, like I mentioned Victorio Peak in that other story that also mentions a Padre LaRue, which may or may not be the central character's name, Victorio Peak sits, when you look at it on a map, it probably sits 40 or 50 miles north of this location, if this location would be close to Oregon, New Mexico, which is why a lot of people say these are two completely separate stories with similar mining and similar storing of gold ingots within the caverns of the mine. So it was also stated that a group of Spanish refugees making their way to Spain had found a church record in Mexico City of the exact location of the mine. And it seemed that if this was true, they were probably staying at a mission in Mexico City awaiting their return to Spain, and they may have found the documents there, which would make you think if there were some documents to be found in Mexico City, it probably would be at a mission there, and that seems to make sense, but there hasn't been a lot of mentions of records found of Padre LaRue or this location. Now, there are a lot of people that state these treasures, this one and Victorio Peak, that they could be the same one, and like I mentioned, they're spaced apart miles wise. I already mentioned that, but they're also spaced apart in time by around 100 years or maybe more. So it does seem like these are two separate stories, and just the end locations of the mine were maybe some 40 or 50 miles apart. And that's not uncommon in some of these areas. If there's a good gold deposit in one area of some mountains, it's not unusual to think that another 30, 40, 50 miles down that row of mountains. If the conditions were right, where there's one gold mine, there very likely could be multiple gold mines or locations to mine gold in these mountains, not just one. Now, I believe Padre LaRue was killed in the Apache attack. And like we mentioned, the Victoria Peak story also mentions a Padre LaRue, and we don't really know if it's just a mix-up and it's the same person or the same name was used, or if it's possible that this family had multiple people that were in the church, and if you could be talking about two people within the same family 100 years apart that were padres in the New World, that could totally be the case too. We really don't know. Plus, too many of the details are just way different leading up to the point of getting to the mining locations. So the mining locations are the only thing that are kind of similar in these stories. Everything else that led up to it are completely different stories and facts and everything like that. Now, today, the lost mine of Padre LaRue would likely be on the White Sands Missile Range and not accessible to the general public at this point. So it seems around the time that this story was published in 1944, that was about the time that the missile range expanded to include this area too. So was that a coincidence or not? We may not know, but it could still be out there, but it very likely is on federal land. And Victoria Peak, of course, is on federal land, and a lot of people say around the time of this article in the mid 1940s or so, a lot of people say that the government did excavate Victoria Peak and they did find tons and tons of gold. So we don't know what happened when they expanded the White Sands Missile Range, which is huge now. It could be that they had a few locations in mind that they wanted to see if they could excavate and find this gold. And so it could be that they have found this gold too, or this could be still hidden behind tons of rock. But anyhow, that is the story of the Padre LaRue treasure. Thanks for listening.